Next up, we have Shaman. And the first card for Shaman we're going to look at is Crushing Hand, which is deal 8 damage to a minion, overload 3. I don't really know that you're looking for even more big removal in a lot of Shaman decks. I don't really know that you're looking for even more overload 3 card, because there seem to be quite a few of them nowadays. Though, to be fair, there seems to be a lot of overload tagged onto sort of minions, whereas this is overload tagged onto an individual removal spell, which I haven't actually seen a ton of. And this is, efficient for its straight up mana cost, even if the overload is pretty hefty. Quite a bit of cards to push the, the snow giant? I forget what it's called. The big overload giant that reduces for each overload that you have paid this game. And this maybe is another tool to go into that style of deck, so you're not just like playing a ton of stuff like Flamewreath Faceless Earth Elemental. I don't really know if that card is good enough to justify the awkwardness of a lot of the overload cards, but it is more tools for that style of deck if you're looking to build it. I've tried building it, and it was never good before. I don't know that this is going to be good enough to make it really viable now. Next up is Grumble, World Shaker. This is another of the cards that I'm super excited about for the set, because this is a card that there's just a ton of stuff you can do. It's a 6-cost 7/7, which up front is like, oh my god, 6-cost 7/7, totally undercosted, super overpowered, yada yada. But it's important to note that the Battlecry on this of return your other minions to your hand, they cost 1, is not pure upside, because this is not a card that you can be beating up your opponent and then just play and keep beating up your opponent, because now all your cards are in your hand. This is a really cool card with any kind of Battlecry effects. An elemental Shaman deck tends to have a lot of Battlecry effects. You're able to pair this with, say, Earth Elementals or Servants of Kalamos, or the healing Taunt Elemental, whose name I forget right now. But just a lot of things that you can play this with that gives you tons of powerful value and possible tempo when you get to replay them for 1 mana. You can very easily try and make some profitable trades, and then ultimately use your Grumble to get all those cards back to reuse their battle cries. So I think this card can both have a lot of just generally powerful effects, because there's a lot of good battle cry cards, just a powerful status minion by itself. Also the fact that it's an elemental curves directly into Blaze Collar, also works very well with Blaze Collar or Kalamos, whatever else. So a lot of potential for this card, and maybe finally enough to actually get Elemental Shaman played more than just as a random casual deck. Next up we have Healing Rain, which is a 3-cost spell, restore 12 health divided randomly among all friendly characters. Obviously, if you have no friendly characters, this just heals you. My guess, I don't really know exactly how this works, my guess is that it only heals stuff that's damaged. It doesn't just divide it amongst things that are undamaged. So if you have no damaged minions and you just have a bunch of totems, this should just heal you for 12 all the time. But there's been a lot of healing in Shaman over sort of the years. This is very reminiscent, of course, of Healing Wave. And if you are looking to play a controlling Shaman deck, sometimes that healing is powerful. But right now I feel like we're not really in a healing type metagame. Because there's so much explosive board presence from Bone Mare decks, and so much threat of 1-turn kill from the combo control style decks. So just the incremental healing that this offers doesn't really feel like it's necessarily a great option in the current metagame, but is definitely potentially powerful if the metagame shifts. Next up, we have the Shaman Spellstone, which is a Lesser Sapphire Spellstone. Now, this is 7 cost to summon 1 copy of a friendly minion. You overload 3 mana crystals to upgrade, and you get summon an additional and summon 2 additional. So summon 1, summon 2, summon 3. And I mentioned the Snow Fury Giant deck, whose name I totally remembered and didn't read from Twitch chat, which is a card that obviously cares a lot about having overload. This also a card that cares a lot about having overload with the crushing fist and similar such things. This is potentially a powerful card with the Snow Fury Giant, being able to reduce the cost of Snow Fury Giant potentially even to 0 by overloading quite a bit, and then play a bunch of them in a single turn with the Spellstone. That is clearly potentially quite powerful. It is unfortunately a play that can walk very much into Anduin, which is an extremely popular card in the current metagame, and also has just tons of setup required. In order to overload enough to play your Snowfear Giant for 0, you're basically going to have spent all your mana either overloaded or overloading every single turn. So it's kind of a bit of a pipe dream, but I definitely think that there's enough there to be worth trying at this point. I always felt like you were a bit short of enough incentive to actually really want to play Snowfury Giant, but the combination of the spellstone and the other overload things like the Crushing Fist, Crushing Foot, Crushing whatever that have been added may be enough to really put it over the edge to at least be a deck that is worth exploring a bit more. Next up is Murmuring Elemental, which is a 2-cost 1/1 elemental. With Battlecry, your next Battlecry this turn triggers twice. And this card is pretty interesting because if we think about the way that Bran was used quite often in many decks, was just to double the Battlecry of one thing. Most of the time, you didn't really expect your Bran to live, and you'd be using Bran to just double the Battlecry of whatever powerful thing that you wanted to do. And with Murmuring Elemental, that's something that it obviously just does. You will be able to double Fire Elemental, double Kalamos, double Servant of Kalamos, double Grumble, and pick everything up twice, which I'm sure does not give you 2 copies of everything, but is at least hilarious. And with Grumble, with Servant of Kalamos, more ways to potentially duplicate into more of this. There's a lot of potential to just kind of do some crazy things as Elemental Shaman with this little guy. So I think this is pretty cool. There is also the Fire Plume Harbinger. So lots of ways to potentially discount things to get faster versions of double this, double that. But I think that most commonly this would be used with either Servant of Kalamos or Fire Elemental, or maybe just Kalamos itself to actually just get the sort of bonus effects from the straightforwardly powerful things in that style of deck. I don't know, again, that there's necessarily room for that kind of grindy value deck in the way that the metagame feels like it is likely to shape up, which is still lots of big minion decks, lots of Jade Druid, lots of Kazakus Priest, and lots of very aggressive decks. I feel like value style decks are just among the worst place they've been in sort of Hearthstone's history because of the existence of one-turn kill control decks, whether they're Quest Mage or Kazakus Priest. And that is really what Elemental Shaman generally stands to play out as, which is a grindy value deck. And there's just a lot of difficult matchups for that style of deck right now. Next up, we have Primal Talisman, which is give your minions death rattle, summon a random basic totem. Nah. This is a card that maybe it lets you set up to really, really ensure that you have minions on board to Bloodlust. There are also some Totem synergy cards, which we'll get to momentarily. But I think this is a tough card to justify playing in most decks. It's kind of neat, but I think that usually you're going to be better off playing either Spirit Echo if you're looking to play like a grindy value game, or just playing something else like more minions that you can play to reload rather than this. The only real scenarios where I see this being particularly effective are specifically trying to protect a big board to Bloodlust, or to try to enable this fellow, who we're skipping forward to, Windshear Stormcaller, which is a 5-cost 5/5, which is okay. Okay stats, not amazing, but with Battlecry, if you control all 4 basic totems, summon Alakir the Windlord. This card is pretty interesting because not just the fact that you get access to additional possible Alakirs in your deck, but you get them for 5 mana. The fact that you can have this guy play your Stormcaller and get an Alakir into play and still have mana to Bloodlust is a pretty big deal. This is theoretically a card that you can play with the double your Battlecry's elemental and get multiple Alakirs, but I think we're kind of living in a pipe dream world where we have 4 totems already and then can spend all this mana. In both cases, whether with the double Battlecry guy or with Bloodlust itself, you're usually going to be playing games where your opponent is killing at least one of your totems each turn, so you're usually going to have to at least spend a mana to hero power with your 3 totems, or play things that make multiple totems in a turn, like the death rattle thing we were just talking about. There's also the Kobold Hermit. This guy I actually think is just obviously potentially powerful with the Stormcaller who summons you a Alakir, but also I think it's just a totally reasonable card on its own in certain metagames. it potentially is just a 2-cost 1/1 plus a 0/2 taunt, or a 2-cost 1/1 plus a Wrath of Air totem. You're almost always going to, use it in those situations for those specific totems because they are your best totem options. I mean, we saw just Kobold Geomancer get played in the World Championship deck from Amnesiac last year because of the value of spell power in a lot of matchups with Maelstrom Portal and such. So I can easily imagine a metagame where that's true again. And there are a lot of Shaman cards that can take advantage of spell damage in that way. So this is, I think, a pretty innocuous looking card that has a lot of potential, both with totem synergy effects as well as just for spell power or taunt on demand. Next up, we have the Rune Spear, the Shaman legendary weapon, which I'm pretty convinced is mostly a meme card. I was holding out my judgment, as to whether there were a lot of good spells in this set that were non-targeted. There's the Healing Rain card, which is obviously potentially a reasonable hit off of Rune Spear because it's non-targeted. But there's no ancestral knowledge. There's no big payoff for using the Rune Spear and hitting a really expensive card that doesn't have a target but has huge upside. You can hit Volcano, you can hit Lightning Storm. There's a lot of non-targeted things, but there's not that many non-targeted things that you want to spend 8 mana, attack into something, and then maybe cast. It just feels like the fact that you have to attack up front before you have any idea what the spell is makes so many of the things that you can get incredibly inefficient, Especially in a metagame where if things continue, and I imagine they likely will, where cards like Bone Marrow are popular, it's really difficult to swing a 3-attack weapon on turn 8 without any knowledge of what you're going to get off of the weapon's effect. So I think this is a cool card. It's definitely a neat card, a fun card, but I would be shocked if it turns out to be a competitive card. And last up, because we jumped around a little bit, is Unstable Evolution. This card, I do think, has the potential to be pretty powerful. We talked about this a bit on Omnistone, about how this and Evolve both kind of go into decks that have a lot of similar cards, but are used very differently. This is a card that is very good with individual minions that are good to evolve, and has the ability to be sort of the first thing you do in a turn, rather than just the last thing you do in a turn, like Evolve itself. I think this is, obviously has the crazy highlight reel potential of hitting something that reduces the cost of your spells, evolving forever. But even just by itself, late in the game when you have little to nothing, this card is just powerful. In the middle of the game, being able to just hit, a single doppelgangster or a single guy that survived, or you just have a totem. All right, I got 6 mana and a totem. I make a 6-drop. That's just reasonably powerful in a lot of spots. So I think this card is both just a cool highlight reel type card and potentially a powerful card for a lot of the Shaman decks that exist already. Next up, we have Warlock, and let's start with my favorite Warlock card in the set, which is Cataclysm, which is discard your hand, destroy all minions. I have played Deathwing in discard Warlock decks, in part just because I just want to discard my hand. And one of the biggest flaws that discard Warlock has is that it doesn't have the ability to consistently play high mana spells. A lot of what the Warlock quest wants to do is play a medium to long game because it provides you with consistent value over turns that allows you to pressure your opponent or trade with their minions. But it's difficult to play a controlling deck in which you're playing a lot of cards that force you to discard because you have trouble getting to the later stages of the game and having those control cards in your hand. Also, just sometimes surviving the middle turns of the game is difficult when you run the risk of not having the right tools at the right time because there's specific removal spells you need against different things, or just you get overwhelmed because your opponent plays a bunch of big things because that's kind of the metagame that exists right now. This card solves almost all of that in a lot of ways. Yes, it says discard your hand, and that's scary, but when you're playing discard Warlock, you have access to A, the quest, which gives you a major payoff after you do discard your hand in a lot of cases. B, life tap, which allows you to reload after you have discarded your hand. And C, and perhaps most powerfully, Malchezaar's Imp, which alongside Cataclysm not only allows you to blow up the board for 5 mana effectively, but also just totally reloads your hand. So you get to trigger your quest a ton of times, blow up your opponent's entire board, and then just reload. And that's super strong. I have felt like Discard Warlock is massively underrated by a lot of people. A lot of people are like, oh, the deck's terrible, it's just a meme deck, blah, 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 blah. I actually think it's been like sort of in the cusp of reasonable playability at a couple of points. I don't think it is right now, but I think it has been. And I think that Cataclysm may actually make the deck legitimately viable. So I'm super excited to mess around with this card and prove ultimately to everyone that Blood Queen Lanethel can go into a good deck. Next up we have Dark Pact, which is 1-cost spell, destroy a friendly minion, restore 8 health to your hero. This is an interesting card. Life gain is very valuable in Warlock. There's a lot of Warlock cards that you can profitably destroy. There's Possessed Villager, there's various like imps off of things, and Dark Pact in a controlling deck can often give you enough sort of breathing room for very cheap that you can sort of make it to the later stages of the game. Alongside Mistress of Mixtures, alongside the new Death Rattle Recruit a Warlock card, this has a lot of just proactive ways that you can use it as well that seems like it offers some powerful synergies. I think this card is definitely very interesting because of just the sheer value of life gain Warlock due to life tap. And I think that it has some potential to possibly find a home in some controlling Warlock decks, and certainly in decks that are looking to sacrifice their own minions. Next up we have a 4-mana 7/7, so it's clearly the perfect card. I think this card is really interesting. This is a 4-mana 4/4 to start, with Battlecry. If you have 15 or less health, gain +3/+3 and taunt. So there are a number of cards in this particular set that care about damaging your own hero or cause you to damage your own hero, and this is clearly one of them. A 4-mana 7/7 obviously is very powerful. We've seen that before. This one has an upside, not a drawback. Though it is worth noting that because it's a Battlecry, you don't get a 4-mana 7/7 if you do summon it back with Gul'dan. I think this is a card that may change the way that people play against Warlock. Obviously, we've seen Warlock without a ton of healing, without like Molten Giants these days. Often the best way to beat Warlock is just to try and rush them down. And with the existence of Hooked Reaver, we're going to see more of the Molten Giant scenario where you really need to pace your damage against Warlock decks or run the risk of getting punished by a Hooked Reaver. Against a lot of powerful tempo decks, as a Warlock, you can take a ton of damage early, and you have a lot of ways to damage yourself early to enable the Hooked Reaver as well. So I think this card is quite powerful, though its power level does hinge quite a bit on how much people are expecting it, because there is the opportunity for them to play around it. But I do think that this is a card that will certainly find at least some homes. Doubtful will be a staple, but I do think it will see some play in Constructed. But this card is definitely one that will be a staple. A 1-cost 2/1, Battlecry, draw a card, deal 2 damage to your hero. So this is basically a 2/1 that comes with a life tap attached. It's not a demon, so it is sometimes good, sometimes bad. You do want demons in some of these decks, but it's not a demon to sort of muck up your ability to bring back demons with Gul'dan in some decks later in the game because it's weak. This card is just super good. Drawing cards, obviously powerful. Playing minions that are reasonably statted is reasonably powerful too. Oftentimes the drawback of playing small, like a 2/1 for 1, is that, well, if it gets killed, especially by like a Patches or a Hero Power, you're behind in resources. But the fact that this just draws a card immediately allows it to not give you any sort of downside against those scenarios. And if your opponent doesn't easily kill it, well, it's obviously like pretty pure upside. The drawback, of course, is that it does some damage to you, but so do a lot of Warlock cards, so does Life Tap, and you use those pretty regularly too. I can see this seeing play in really any style of Warlock deck whatsoever. In an aggressive deck, it's just a 1-drop that doesn't cost you a card. Even if you play it like after a Keleseth, it could potentially draw you more buffed minions faster. I can see playing this in a control deck, both as just a 1-drop that you can use to fight for the board without giving up resources, as well as an enabler for a Defile later in the game. Being able to play a 1 health minion to turn on your multi-tick Defiles can be very powerful in a lot of spots. So this card is just great, and I expect it to see tons of play in pretty much every Warlock deck. Next up we have the Warlock Spellstone, Lesser Amethyst Spellstone. which is a 4-cost spell with lifesteal. Deal 3 damage to a minion. So up front, not super strong. It's twice the cost of Drain Soul and not nearly twice the power, but it upgrades. And the upgrade is to take damage from your own cards. It's obviously a great card with synergy for a controlling or mid-range deck, even with Kobold Librarian. So a big part of why I think that card will see quite a bit of play in a wide variety of Warlock decks. And it upgrades to deal 5 damage and deal 7 damage. So effectively, at first upgrade, it turns into a Holy Fire that can't target your opponent's face. That is a card that is seeing play right now. With the popularity of Kobolds Scalebane, 5 damage is a pretty major threshold. So being able to remove that and gain 5 life back for just 4 mana is pretty huge for a controlling deck. It also kills Dreadlord, and just generally is just a very, very powerful swing of being able to gain 5 life and remove a minion from the board. And if you upgrade it yet again, 7 damage. That kills many Bone Mared minions. That kills even a buffed Kobold Scalebane, a buffed Bone Mare. So this kind of thing is quite powerful. As I mentioned when I was discussing some of the previous cards with Dark Pact, life gain is very valuable in Warlock. Because of life tap, being able to restore life, especially in big increments, is very, very strong because you have the ability to use your life total as a resource. So when you're attaching that life gain to a card that can already bring you a pretty strong tempo swing and doesn't have a conditional that's oppressive because there are so many good ways to activate it, I think this is a card that's going to see a lot of play in controlling Warlock decks. It's not quite as swingy powerful some of the cards that exist right now, so it may not quite find a home immediately, but I think this is a card as the metagame shapes up and perhaps after the rotation will end up being a staple. Next up we have Possessed Lackey, a 2/2 for 5 with Death Rattle Recruit a Demon. This obviously straight up is a weird card. It's a 5-cost 2/2, which is having a 5-drop that is vulnerable to Potion of Madness is pretty scary. Unless your opponent has an Illidan in their deck, they're at least not going to get value off of their Potion of Madness. Obviously wants to go with cards that kill your own stuff, like maybe Dark Pact, so you can ensure you get the trigger on it immediately. But this is, I think, one of the cards in the set that encourages sort of a big demon type archetype. There's a number of big demons, as well as just abilities to get them into play quickly, that this could potentially be a major factor in that style of deck. I don't think this is a card that will just sort of see play in a typical deck. Obviously, this is pretty poor alongside Flame Imp or Voidwalker, but it does have a lot of potential if your deck is filled with giant demons, and this set has a few giant demons that it might be able to fit with. So we will see. Next up we have Rune the First Disciple. I am not going to go through and show all of the various seals, but effectively this keeps giving you 5-cost spells that make progressively larger demons until it eventually makes a gigantic demon that destroys your opponent's deck. This card, I think, is mostly just kind of a crazy story, highlight reel meme card, just because you spend so much mana getting to the point of actually playing the gigantic demon to destroy your opponent's deck, that it's pretty difficult to ever get off in a legitimate game. I think that if we did exist in a world of grindy value games, that maybe this card could find a home. Perhaps after the rotation, when Raza is gone and the burst potential of priest decks is not nearly so high, there's a world in which you can spend a ton of mana over a bunch of turns not killing your opponent, and actually sort of grind them out by killing their deck. But I think that you're going to find yourself getting blown up by something before you can actually get through all of the seals. So I do think this is a super cool card. I'm certain that I'm going to play with it, but I seriously doubt it's going to see competitive play. Next up we have Skull of the Manari, much like the Possessed Lackey, clearly a card that goes into a big demon deck. This is a weird card because I expect this card to be terrible in the first few weeks of the expansion. If you heard everything people are talking about leading up to the expansion, a lot of people were saying that, legendary weapons, everyone's going to have, every ooze, Harrison Jones. And if that is true, then Skull of the Manari is terrible, because this is the legendary weapon that is punished the most by removal, because you don't get a swing off of it or anything like that first. You get no effect, you spent 5 mana to do nothing. However, if this does stay in play, it has a potential to give you a pretty big discount on your demons. I originally thought this was actually a recruit effect, And that was, pretty exciting because just having this in play, no matter what, you were generating huge demons every single turn. The fact that it summons from your hand does at least give it the cost that you must have drawn these gigantic demons already. So it is less powerful than I originally envisioned. But if you're playing a Warlock deck, you have life tap. So if your deck is full of a significant number of big demons, there's a very good chance that you'll have big demons in your hand each turn while this is in play. But it's not nearly as big of a payoff as I initially envisioned. So may not have quite the, stays in play, win the game correlation that I originally thought. Next up, we have Voidlord, clearly a powerful card with the Skull or with the Possessed Lackey, but also just a pretty powerful defensive demon for any kind of controlling Warlock deck. One problem that I faced very frequently when I was trying to build Cruel decks was that there were essentially no or very few good defensive demons that I could put into play off of Cruel. So if I was behind, it was almost impossible for me to ever find an opportunity to play Cruel. Even though it was a big board swing, I would just die. But with Voidlord, that's a possibility that you just play your Cruel, have a huge defensive posture, and your opponent can't kill you, and you run them over with demons. I think this is a card that has a lot of potential because it's kind of like a sludge belcher on steroids. Your opponent has to punch through it multiple times. And obviously extremely powerful with Gul'dan. And not only do you bring this back, you bring the Voidwalkers back, so you can really gum up the board against anyone who's actually trying to defeat you with minions. So I think this card has a ton of potential in controlling Warlock, and I expect to see a pretty significant amount of play. Last up for Warlock is the Vulgar Homunculus. It's a 2/4 taunt for 2 with Battlecry, deal 2 damage to your hero. So obviously compares well to Wormrest Agent, which is a very strong card in Priest, and also synergizes with the spellstone. It's a demon, so if you are looking for defensive demons to bring back with Gul'dan, it has a lot of power there. This card is just great. I think this card is potentially very strong in Zoo. It's a difficult minion for your opponent to kill, can protect your early game minions. You play a Flame Imp into this, very difficult for a lot of opponents to end up connecting with your Flame Imp, removing your board. The fact that it's a demon makes Crystal Weaver a lot more powerful. It makes Blood Fury Potion a lot more powerful because it has high health, difficult for your opponent to remove, so has a very good chance of sticking around to get those buffs. I think this card is just really, really strong. This and the Kobold, I think, are two of the more powerful cards in the set, especially as cheaper cards that can fit into a lot of different roles. So I expect this card to see a ton of play. Moving on to Warrior. First up is the Bladed Gauntlet, a 2-cost weapon with 0 attack and 2 durability, but has attack equal to your armor and cannot attack heroes. This is a weird card because it is a 2-cost weapon, but it's a 2-cost weapon that can't kill anything on turn 2 unless you somehow gained armor on turn 1, and also requires additional investment to pay off. And I've seen a lot of people who say they think this card is like extremely powerful, and I think it's maybe reasonable, but it's difficult for me to imagine this card being all that good because it requires a lot to be going right in order for it to actually be used to kill your opponent's stuff, and also kind of has negative synergy. It has negative synergy like with itself because once you attack something with it, well, if you killed a big thing, you lose all that armor, so now you really can't attack another big thing. If you're behind in the board, your opponent's chipping away at your armor, so you need to play additional armor to actually enable this. So I'm not really terribly convinced that this is a card that's going to see a lot of play. I think this card, is definitely a card that has a lot of potential upside, but feels like it requires too much to go right and doesn't really fill a hole that Warrior really needs. I mean, I guess Warrior does need a 2-drop, but you have to basically play like this into shield block in order for it to kill something most of the time. And that's effectively committing 2 turns, and it kind of feels like you might as well armor up and then play a War Axe much of the time because you're at least guaranteed your War Axe is going to hit something. Next up we have Drywhisker Armorer, who is a 2-drop, but he's not a 2-drop that you usually want to play on turn 2. Unless your opponent has curved out a ton. I don't think this is really something you want to be playing on 2 generally, but even if your opponent just played a Patches, played a Pirate into Patches, playing this and gaining 4 armor is pretty strong. You're challenging their board and you're gaining a bunch of life, which can be, a pretty powerful tempo play. The question is really what deck does this go in? The biggest issue, as I mentioned before, that Warrior really has right now is it's missing good early game. And this is sort of early game. Maybe this just goes into like a control warrior deck that wants to build up armor. Maybe not with Bladed Gauntlet, maybe with some other armor synergy cards. It feels like Cult Apothecary, basically, but obviously way less and giving you armor instead of healing, has some upside, because Cult Apothecary has been like an okay card in some decks, but has never been a superstar. At like less than half the price, maybe that's powerful enough. So I think this is definitely at least a card that has metagame applications. If there's a lot of decks that are playing a lot of minions, I think this card could be like totally nuts. You're playing 2 mana and getting like 5, 10, well I guess not 5, like 6 to 10 armor, and that's really powerful. Especially because it isn't just spend the mana to get the armor. You have this guy in play that can at least somewhat help contest the board. So definitely has the potential, but not really like an auto-include type card, at least in my eyes right now. Next up we have Gather Your Party, the sort of basic recruit card of the set. This is actually one of my favorite cards in the set, because I feel like giving Warrior the potential to have like a big minion base deck makes a lot of sense, given the tools that Warrior has, like for controlling the game and such. And it just like lets Warrior have a way to win the game like conclusively, rather than kind of grinding out opponents' minions, which has been the way that most control warrior decks have typically functioned. I like the fact that this card really makes you reevaluate the sort of things you want to put into your deck. Almost every warrior deck for a long time has had like Acolyte of Pain, Armorsmith, Battle Rage, all these sort of staples. And I feel like this really makes you reimagine the sort of cards that you want to actually play in your deck, because it plays so poorly with cheap minions. So I am definitely looking forward to building a warrior recruit deck alongside the hunter recruit deck. Those are some of the things that I think are the most interesting deck building challenges, and I'm looking forward to taking them on. Next up we have Gemstudded Golem. 6 cost 5/9, taunt, can only attack if you have 5 or more armor. We saw a similar card in Druid, the 3/6 for 4 that can only attack if you have 3 or more armor. I think this sort of card is interesting, that essentially is like a taunt that is clearly intended for a more controlling deck. A 9 health, 5 attack taunt for 6 is pretty tough for people to get through, and also, pretty damaging to minions that try to attack into it. So I actually think this card has, some potential to be pretty powerful. It's a little bit weird because a lot of controlling warrior decks typically have a bunch of spells that they're looking to use in the later stages of the game, rather than necessarily just throwing down minions that are potentially vulnerable to like Vilespine Slayers and such. But this is, a major roadblock for a lot of minion-based decks, even at that late stage of the game. 9 is just a lot of health, and I would not be surprised to see this card getting a decent amount of play. Next up is Sculptor Yip. This is kind of the new Rot Face, basically, right? This is end your turn, summon a random minion with cost equal to your armor, up to 10. 8 health is, a decent amount, but it is an 8-drop, and it requires you to, have the armor immediately or gain it after you play the Geosculpt or whatever. But I don't know. I feel like this is an interesting end game win condition for a controlling deck, kind of like a Rot Face, in that you're just sort of giving your opponent a variety of stuff that they have to deal with. It's better than Rot Face in the sense that it doesn't necessarily require mana to enable. You can just kind of have your armor and be sort of stabilized in the game, and you play your Geosculptor, and now your opponent is forced to deal with whatever big minion you get off the Geosculptor, as well as the Geosculptor itself. So I actually think that this has potential as more than just a meme card. I think this card can be quite powerful, because it demands multiple pieces of removal and doesn't really ask that much of your deck other than you having armor, which is something that a lot of controlling warrior decks are going to naturally have. So I think this is a solid card that I'm certainly going to play, at least for a meme potential, but I do think may legitimately see competitive play. Next up is Kobold Barbarian. It's a 3 mana 4/4. At the start of your turn, attack a random enemy. I don't really know that we're looking for this style of card even in kind of an aggressive warrior deck right now. There's already Frothing Berserker and other like pretty decent early game warrior minions. Obviously, South Sea Captain is another very powerful 3-drop. Maybe once Patches rotates, this is a card that like an aggressive warrior deck might lean to, because it can just sort of beat up, especially controlling opponents. So my understanding is that this does count as attack or does not. Does it attack twice? Because I'm not sure. And that obviously, makes a big difference in terms of the power of it. If it gets to attack twice, it's actually very strong against like a controlling deck, but I don't think it does. I think it just randomly attacks, and that's its attack for the turn. If it's the latter, if it randomly attacks and that's its attack for the turn, then it's just kind of like a worse Ogre Brute, right? Because an Ogre Brute at least gets to attack when you want it to attack, so you can kill minions first. So it feels a little bit weird that it's a class card that's just a worse Ogre Brute. And Ogre Brute didn't really see play when it was around, so I find it unlikely that the Kobold Barbarian will. Next up we have Lesser Mithril Spellstone, which is a 7-cost 5/5 Mithril Golem, which obviously straight up is pretty poor. You equip a weapon to upgrade it, and you can then get 2 or 3 5/5 Mithril Golems. This card feels pretty bad to me, because you're building up to this board filling thing that then dies to all of the popular board clears in the format. Can't actually keep you alive at all. It's not defensively oriented. These don't have taunt. There's really not much that this is accomplishing against aggressive decks, and there's not that much that it's doing against controlling decks, because, well, it doesn't actually present that much threat when there's so many ways to remove the minions it creates. Maybe this is a card that you want to play in a recruit-based deck because you want to have a higher density of potential threats that are not minions, because you are planning on playing Gather Your Party and such. But it still just feels like you're not really getting that much out of it. It's a big expense that isn't defending you and isn't really particularly resilient to anything your opponents are going to use to kill it. So I'm not impressed. If this were up 4 6s, I'd be in love with this card. I think this card would be bananas if it made lower attack, higher health minions, because then it would survive the more commonly played removal. But as it stands, it just walks too readily into both Dragonfire and Anduin, and I just can't get excited about it. Next up we have Reckless Flurry. 3 costs, spend all of your armor, deal that much damage to all minions. So this is basically Shield Flurry rather than Blade Flurry, and this is a pretty powerful card. Obviously, if you're playing a deck that has the ability to gain significant amounts of armor, you do run the risk of just getting overwhelmed by minions anyway. I have been generally unimpressed by Brawls lately. I have felt like Brawl is a card that so often just leaves your opponent with a big minion, because that's what the middle and late turns of the game tend to be against most minion-based decks, are Bone Mares, Bone-Mared minions, Kobold Scalebanes, and Kobold Scalebane minions. So just leaving any of those up is really pretty brutal. This is kind of like a Brawl-style card that doesn't run that risk. So I think this card is quite powerful, and I do think that it has a lot of chance to see a good amount of play, especially if the metagame remains similar to what it is now. If the metagame does shift, in part due to the presence of Duskbreaker, you may be in a world where people are not necessarily playing boards that are as vulnerable to Flurry. But right now, I think this card seems quite good. And next up for Warrior, we have Unidentified Shield, a 6-cost Unidentified card, gains 5 armor, then has an additional bonus effect, which is determined when you draw it. And the different effects are gain 10 more armor. I also love that this is Tower Shield plus 10 with that little D&D reference there. Serrated Shield, gain 5 armor, deal 5 damage. Rune Shield, gain 5 armor, summon a 5/5 golem, aka Shield Maiden. And Spike Shield, which is gain 5 armor, equip a 5/2 weapon. So this is kind of like a Ironhide stapled to Bring It On, just a Shield Maiden. I guess not Ironhide stapled to Shield Maiden, or an Arcanite Reaper. All of these are reasonable, and I think that you would individually play the Shield Maiden effect certainly. But I'm less convinced that this is a card that a lot of decks are going to be excited about, because the just gain a ton of armor is not super powerful in a lot of matchups. The Holy Fire-ish effect is not super powerful in a lot of matchups. And the Arcanite Reaper effect is, in a lot of decks, you're not necessarily super excited about that weapon. But I do think this is a card that could possibly have potential in the recruit decks that I was discussing. Because, again, when you're playing a deck that needs to have a certain density of lower cost or middle cost, non-minion cards that can impact the board meaningfully, I think this is the style of card that you might go to, because being able to gain some armor, especially if you are playing Shield Flurry, I forget what it's called actually, in your deck and just want more consistent ways to power that up, this is one of the ways you can do it. That's not just going to be a pure like bring it on type effect or Ironhide type effect. You'll get additional value attached to it. And I think that pretty much all of these, like if you look at the Rune Shield, Spike Shield, and Serrated Shield, all of those can do something to interact with the board, whether it's killing a minion or generating a minion. Both the Spike Shield and Serrated Shield can take out like a Kobold Scalebane, not quite on curve, but close at least. And then Rune Shield can generate a minion along with the armor. And armor is, even against a lot of the controlling decks in the current metagame, actually pretty good, because the controlling decks in some cases tend to be Kazaka's Priest, which looks to burn you out, where armor gain is actually a pretty big deal. So I think this card is actually a little bit better than it looks because of that combination of factors. I do think this is a card that I'll certainly be playtesting in my recruit decks early on, and seeing how well it does play there. I don't expect it to see like widespread play, but I do think that it will be adopted in some decks. And our last warrior card and last class card overall is Woecleaver. This is the warrior legendary weapon, 8 cost. After your hero attacks, recruit a minion. This is obviously pretty powerful card for the recruit style decks. Because first swing, you're guaranteed to recruit. There's nothing your opponent can do, like even with weapon removal, to block that. And if it does remain in play for all 3 swings, it's just super, super powerful because you get to potentially recruit 3 minions at the time of your choosing. I think this card is particularly powerful, or particularly attractive at least, because of Forge of Souls. I've been playing a lot of Forge of Souls in my controlling warrior decks simply because Bloodrazor is so good. And I haven't really found another weapon that I'm really excited to have in those decks, but Forge of Souls by itself has actually been very powerful. If you're playing a recruit-based deck, you're probably not going to play Battle Rage, which is sort of the other go-to, or really the go-to card drawing effect in Warrior. So you're probably going to want to play something like Forge of Souls. And having the ability to access Woecleaver, almost guaranteed because of the potential presence of double Forge of Souls in your deck, is quite powerful. Any game you're playing against a controlling deck, having access to this is very, very strong. Obviously, people can have weapon removal, but at worst, you're getting a swing off of it once you play it, and that gives you, likely in a recruit deck, a lot of value to begin with. So it's also pretty important because it gives you redundancy of your recruit. If you're playing, just the 2 gather your parties, you don't necessarily have enough ways to sort of cheat any of the sort of drawback type minions you have in your deck into play. So I expect to play this card in those decks, and I expect it to be a powerful card in the warrior recruit decks. So I think this card has actually been a little bit underrated from what I've seen the people say about it so far. And I do expect it to see a reasonable amount of competitive play.